Welcome to Sci-Fi Secrets. Seeing as Villeneuve?
So Denis Villeneuve.
Denis Villeneuve.
Denis Villeneuve. Do not pronounce the S to Denis, it is silent in French.
Is going to make a Rama movie. It seems I'm coming back to this series sooner than I expected. This is the spoilers version of the video. If you don't want the movie to be spoiled for you, but are still curious about the plot of Rendezvous with Rama, then I would strongly suggest you watch my other video, which has the minimum possible amount of spoilers, linked in the vid info, and if I remember to do it, on screen right now. This video is only if you have already read the book and want a refresher on what happens, or if you have no intention of reading the book and don't care about knowing what is going to be in the movies. If it's actually made, that is. This isn't the first time a Rama movie was planned. In 2013, Morgan Freeman planned to direct a Rendezvous with Rama movie that never came to anything. So, you have been warned. Now, let's get to the story. Rendezvous with Rama starts in the year 2130 with the detection of Rama, which is assumed to be a rogue asteroid from outside the solar system, just like Oumuamua, which is rare enough in itself. But as soon as it's found to have a spin of 1 revolution every 4 minutes, this is, as of yet, unheard of in astronomy. The typical asteroid has a rotation of 1 rotation every few hours at the fastest. So a probe is proposed, and thanks to office politics, one is sent to look at Rama. But with Rama's massive speed, it would just be a very rapid flyby. The images from this flyby stop the world. This asteroid is a perfect cylinder, about 40 kilometers in length and 20 kilometers in diameter. The asteroid is no asteroid at all. It is clearly artificially made. And with its trajectory and speed, it has been traveling for at minimum 200,000 years. That is when it passed its last solar system. But that solar system has no habitable planets, so Rama was probably traveling for much longer than that. A spaceship was dispatched. It was sent to investigate Rama to see if it was a threat. The Endeavour was that spaceship, led by Commander Norton. With the spin of the cylinder, there were only 2 spots on Rama that Endeavour could land. The center of the 2 poles of the cylinder, where Rama's spin wouldn't throw anything that landed right back off into space. Upon landing on what they dubbed as the North Pole, they discover 3 simple airlock systems, all equally spread 120 degrees apart. When Commander Norton tried to open one, it opened as if it were brand new, sliding and spinning freely even in the cold vacuum of space, which is well known for vacuum welding metal together. After waiting for approval from command, the crew of Endeavour are allowed to enter Rama. The crew floats down the corridor and enter the pitch-black interior of Rama. They use flares to briefly light up the interior of Rama, and what they see is staggering to their minds. It was an inside-out world all its own. The interior of Rama was mostly empty space, but the interior surface of the cylinder was covered in what seemed to be farms, towns, cities, and most impressive of all, a cylindrical sea. From where they stood, 3 stairways, all equally spaced, led from the 3 airlocks they entered down to the floor of the spinning cylinder. The spin of the cylinder, of course, creating an artificial gravity at the interior surface. They had already done the math, and it seems that with a spin of 0.25 RPM and a radius of about 10 kilometers minus the thickness of the floor, it would impart an artificial gravity on the interior surface of around 0.65 G, or 65% of Earth's gravity. But this was only on the interior surface of the cylinder. At the axis of the cylinder where they entered, the gravity would be effectively 0, with a progression to higher and higher gravity as the crew went down the stairs to the surface of Rama. Just the stairs by themselves were amazing. Each stairway was almost 10 kilometers tall as Mount Everest, with several terraced plateaus built in, perfect to rest on during your trip up or down the stairs. The stairs themselves were unremarkable. They seemed to be very similar to any you would find on Earth, both in looks and size. The distance between the steps increases as you get higher and gravity decreases, making them not very useful for figuring out the size of the beings they were created for. The best guess the crew could make is that maybe they were 50% taller than a human at most. But the lowest steps near the bottom could be taken 2 at a time by a human descending, so that may or may not be true. The flares exposed several major landmarks to the crew. From the crew and getting further away, the first of these was the stairs leading down to the floor of Rama. Then, the near floor of Rama, that had all kinds of strange markings that could be farms or towns. This was dubbed the Northern Cylindrical Plain. Next, near the midway point of Rama, about 20 kilometers from either end, there was a cylindrical sea wrapping all the way around the interior of Rama like a belt, but in reverse. And in that sea was what looked like a futuristic version of Manhattan, an island full of what seemed to be skyscrapers made by an alien race, stunning to see. On the far side of the sea was a 500-meter cliff, making it seem that the sea would only be accessible from one side, because if you traveled to the other side, you would have to scale a perfectly flat 500-meter tall cliff to get to land again. Then beyond the cliff was the southern cylindrical plain, similar to the northern one at the base of the stairs. As the crew made their way down the stairs to the closer plane of Rama, gravity and oxygen increased with each step until finally they were on the floor of Rama, able to breathe oxygen. While on the floor of Rama, they did not need their spacesuits for air and were able to explore freely, but the temperature of the interior of Rama was well below freezing, so while not needing their spacesuits for air, they still need to keep them on for heat, although the entire crew took their helmets off. From their flare-light reconnaissance, they had seen what seemed to be a city about 8 kilometers from the base of the stairway they were descending. They decided to go to that. Part of the crew stayed up on one of the plateaus on the stairs and watched the floor team going to the city through their telescopes with a large spotlight. The floor team made their way through the pitch-black frozen interior of Rama with their flashlights. When they reached the so-called city, however, all they found was a group of large rectangular structures, all identical, and none of them had any way inside. But strangely, they had what appeared to be rails for some kind of cart or rail car leading to each and every one, but no way in or out where the rails ran into the structures. Disappointed in not being able to find anything worthwhile, they carried on. Most of Endeavor was inside Rama at this point, leading to a very interesting line. The joke went around that Endeavor was really being run by the 4 simps, and that Goldie had been given the rank of acting commander. This was actually about genetically engineered monkeys that they call simps, but I thought it was kind of a funny line. Anyway, the crew was broken up into teams and sent to different areas to investigate. As the teams made their way around the interior of Rama, Rama had been rapidly making its way towards the inner solar system, and its skin had been heating up from the sun. Slowly but surely, that warmed up the interior of Rama. By the time it was above freezing in Rama, the skin of Rama was over 500 degrees, and the first crew members made it to the cylindrical sea. On the north side of this sea, there was a 50-meter drop to what appeared to be ice, with stairways spread along its circumference to allow access to the ice. On the far side of the sea, the drop was 500 meters high, and no stairs could be seen. When everything else had been so symmetrical, why was one side of the sea so much taller than the other? From their perspective at the edge of the 50-meter cliff, they had a good look at the island in the middle of the cylindrical sea. They had dubbed it New York because of its resemblance to Manhattan Island. But from this distance, it looked as unlike a city as the boxes of Paris had. But where Paris was drab and square, this gave the impression of a strange machine designed for some inexplicable purpose. Finally, the team found one of the stairways down the 50 meters to the sea and took a sample of the ice. This was no clean water, however. The ice looked dark blue and smelled odd. And when they tested it, it contained all kinds of chemicals that you would not want to drink, and no life. After a few days inside Rama, the outside temperature was over 500 degrees on the skin of Rama, and there were groups of people trying to figure out ways across the ice to New York. There were also people studying Paris, the nearest quote-unquote city. And there were also several other groups sent out to other so-called cities, that they had also named after major cities on Earth. London seemed to be a pumping station, made out of cylindrical buildings with pipes connecting them. Moscow was similar to Paris in that it was more square or rectangular buildings, but none of the cities had any entrances. No matter how hard the crew looked, they could not find a way into any of the structures. The crew was unable to see what was inside any of them, and it was beginning to frustrate Commander Norton. An expedition was proposed to sled across the ice of New York when an urgent communication was received from Earth. They had done the simulations, and the heat on the outside of Rama heating up the interior was bound to cause strong hurricane-like winds inside Rama as the hot air from the surface of Rama transferred to the interior surface and heated the air. The hot air then would try to rise to the center of Rama, where it would encounter the slower-moving cold air already up there. This would cause a sideways hurricane with the eye of the storm on the spinning axis of Rama. This news was at first ignored by Commander Norton, who went to sleep, only to wake up to the loudest sound of his life. Not even a hurricane could have created the sound that did wake Norton and the whole camp in a single instant. It seemed that the sky was falling, or that Rama had split open and was tearing itself apart. First there was a rending crack, and then a long drawn-out series of crystalline crashes, like a million glass houses being demolished. It lasted for minutes, though it seemed like hours. It was still continuing, apparently moving away into the distance, when Norton got to the message center. "Hub control, what's happened?" "Just a moment, Skipper. It's over by the sea. We're getting the light on it." 8 kilometers overhead on the axis of Rama, the searchlight began to swing its beam across the plain. It reached the edges of the sea, then started to track along it, scanning around the interior of the world. A quarter of the way around the cylindrical surface, it stopped. Up there in the sky, or what the mind still persisted in calling the sky, something extraordinary was happening. At first it seemed to Norton that the sea was boiling. It was no longer static and frozen in the grip of an eternal winter. A huge area, kilometers across, was in turbulent movement, and it was changing color. A broad band of white was marching across the ice. Suddenly a slab, perhaps a quarter of a kilometer on a side, began to tilt upward like an opening door. Slowly and majestically it reared into the sky, glittering and sparkling in the beam of the searchlight. Then it slid back and vanished beneath the surface, while a tidal wave of foaming water raced outward in all directions from its point of submergence. Not until then did Norton fully realize what was happening. The ice was breaking up. All these days and weeks the sea had been thawing, far down in the depths. It was hard to concentrate because of the crashing roar that still filled the world and echoed around the sky. But he tried to think of a reason for so dramatic a convulsion. When a frozen lake or river thawed on Earth, it was nothing like this. But of course, it was obvious enough, now that it had happened. The sea was thawing from beneath as the solar heat seeped through the hull of Rama. And when the ice turns into water, it occupies less volume. So the sea had been sinking below the upper layer of ice, leaving it unsupported. Day by day, the strain had been building up. Now, the bank of ice that encircled the equator of Rama was collapsing like a bridge that had lost its central pier. It was splintering into hundreds of floating islands, which would crash and jostle into each other until they, too, melted. Norton's blood ran suddenly cold when he remembered the plans that were being made to reach New York by sledge. The tumult was swiftly subsiding. A temporary stalemate had been reached in the war between ice and water. In a few hours, as the temperature continued to rise, the water would win, and the last vestiges of ice would disappear. But in the long run, ice would be the victor, as Rama rounded the sun and set forth once more into the interstellar night. Norton remembered to start breathing again. Then he called the party nearest the sea. To his relief, Rodrigo answered at once. No, the water hadn't reached them. No tidal wave had come sloshing over the edge of the cliff. "So now we know," he added calmly, "why there is a cliff." Norton agreed silently. But that hardly explains, he thought, why the cliff on the southern shore is 10 times higher. The hub searchlight continued to scan around the world. The awakened sea was steadily calming, and the boiling white foam no longer raced outward from the capsizing ice floes. In 15 minutes, the main disturbance was over. But Rama was no longer silent. It had awakened from its sleep. And ever and again there came the sound of grinding ice as one berg collided with another. Spring had been a little late, Norton told himself, but winter had ended. And there was that breeze again, stronger than ever. Rama had given him enough warnings. It was time to go. So this was enough to get Commander Norton to recall all the crew members back to the ship. But while they were on the stairs ascending back to Endeavor, they got another surprise. Suddenly, Rama was filled with light. The 6 strange trenches they had seen, 2 sets of 3 equally spaced on either end of the cylindrical sea, were actually lights, and someone had just flipped the light switch on. The light was so brilliant that for a full minute Norton had to keep his eyes clenched tightly shut. Then he risked opening them again and stared through barely parted lids at the wall a few centimeters in front of his face. He blinked several times, waited for the involuntary tears to drain away, and then turned slowly to behold the dawn. He could endure the sight for only a few seconds, then he was forced to close his eyes again. It was not the glare that was intolerable. He could grow accustomed to that, but the awesome spectacle of Rama, now seen for the first time in its entirety. Norton had known exactly what to expect. Nevertheless, the sight had stunned him. He was seized by a spasm of uncontrollable trembling. His hands tightened around the rungs of the ladder with the violence of a drowning man clutching at a lifebelt. The muscles of his forearms began to knot, yet at the same time his legs, already fatigued by the hours of steady climbing, seemed about to give way. If it had not been for the low gravity, he might have fallen. Then his training took over, and he began to apply the first remedy for panic. Still keeping his eyes closed and trying to forget the monstrous spectacle around him, he started to take deep, long breaths, filling his lungs with oxygen and washing the poisons of fatigue out of his system. Presently, he felt much better, but he did not open his eyes until he had performed one more action. It took a major effort of will to force his right hand to open. He had to talk to it as though it were a disobedient child, but presently he maneuvered it down to his waist, unclipped the safety belt from his harness, and hooked the buckle to the nearest rung. Now, whatever happened, he could not fall. He took several more deep breaths. Then, still holding his eyes closed, he switched on his radio. He hoped his voice sounded calm and authoritative as he called, "Captain here, is everyone okay?" As he checked off the names one by one and received answers, even if somewhat tremulous ones, from everybody, his own confidence and self-control came swiftly back to him. All his men were safe, and were looking to him for leadership. He was the commander once more. "Keep your eyes closed until you're quite sure you can take it," he called. "The view is overwhelming. If anyone finds that it's too much, keep on climbing without looking back. Remember, you'll soon be at zero gravity, so you can't possibly fall." It was hardly necessary to point out such an elementary fact to trained spacemen, but Norton had to remind himself of it every few seconds. The thought of zero gravity was a kind of talisman, protecting him from harm. Whatever his eyes told him, Rama could not drag him down to destruction on the plane 8 kilometers below. It became an urgent matter of pride and self-esteem that he should open his eyes once more and look at the world around him. But first he had to get his body under control. He let go of the ladder with both hands and hooked his left arm under a rung. Clenching and unclenching his fists, he waited until the muscle cramps had faded away. When he felt quite comfortable, he opened his eyes and slowly turned to face Rama. His first impression was one of blueness. The glare that filled the sky could not have been mistaken for sunlight. It might have been that of an electric arc. So Rama's sun, Norton told himself, must be hotter than ours. That should interest the astronomers. And now he understood the purpose of those mysterious trenches, the straight valley and its 5 companions. They were nothing less than gigantic light strips. Rama had 6 linear suns, symmetrically arranged around its interior. From each, a broad fan of light was aimed across the central axis to shine upon the far side of the world. Norton wondered if they could be switched alternately to produce a cycle of light and darkness, or whether this was a planet of perpetual day. Too much staring at those blinding bars of light had made his eyes hurt again. He was not sorry to have a good excuse to close them for a while. It was not until then, when he had almost recovered from his initial visual shock, that he was able to devote himself to a much more serious problem. Who or what had switched on the lights of Rama? By the most sensitive tests that man could apply to it, this world was sterile, but now something was happening that could not be explained by the actions of natural forces. There might not be life here, but there could be consciousness, awareness. Robots might be waking after a sleep of eons. Perhaps this outburst of light was an unprogrammed random spasm, the last dying gasp of machines that were responding wildly to the warmth of a new sun and would soon lapse again into quiescence, this time forever. Yet Norton could not believe such a simple explanation. Bits of the jigsaw puzzle were beginning to fall into place, though many were still missing. The absence of all signs of wear, for example, and the feeling of newness, as if Rama had just been created. These thoughts might have inspired fear or even terror. Somehow, though, they did nothing of the sort. On the contrary, Norton felt a sense of exhilaration, almost of delight. There was far more here to discover than they had dared to hope. Wait, he said to himself, until the Rama committee hears about this. Then, with calm determination, he opened his eyes again and began a careful inventory of everything he saw. First, he had to establish some kind of reference system. He was looking at the largest enclosed space ever seen by man, and he needed a mental map to find his way around it. The feeble gravity was little help, for with an effort of will, he could switch up and down in any direction he pleased. But some directions were psychologically dangerous. When his mind skirted these, he had to vector it hastily away. Safest of all was to imagine that he was at the bowl-shaped bottom of a gigantic well, 16 kilometers wide and 50 deep. The advantage of this image was that there could be no danger of falling farther. Nevertheless, it had some serious defects. He could pretend that the scattered towns and cities, and the differently colored and textured areas, were all securely fixed to the towering walls. The various complex structures that could be seen hanging from the dome overhead were perhaps no more disconcerting than the pendant candelabra in some great concert hall on Earth. What was quite unacceptable was the cylindrical sea. There it was, halfway up the well shaft, a band of water wrapped completely around it, with no visible means of support. There could be no doubt that it was water, and it was a vivid blue, flecked with brilliant sparkles from the few remaining ice flows. But a vertical sea forming a complete circle 20 kilometers up in the sky was such an unsettling phenomenon that after a while he began to seek an alternative. While the crew of Endeavour took cover from the storm in their ship, the mines back on Earth were working. So Rama was alive after all. Then its trip here was not by accident. Who turned the lights on? Would the citizens of Rama begin to emerge? Would Rama change course or make a braking maneuver around the sun and take up a tactical position where it could militarily dominate the solar system? Did it have propulsion at all? It seemed to not have any thrusters or engines, or for that matter, fuel of any kind. London and its pipes were big, but not nearly big enough to fuel a colossus like Rama for more than a few seconds. Then suddenly, one of the scientists had a realization. The different cliff heights. That was why one cliff was 10 times as tall as the other. With a little math, it was discovered that Rama could brake or accelerate at a maximum of 0.02 Gs, without causing the water in the cylindrical sea to overrun its banks. But why would it need that ability when it had no means of thrust? The scientists and ambassadors decided to tell Commander Norton that the far side of the cylindrical sea was top priority. If there were any answers to be found in Rama, they must be there. Back on Endeavour, one of the crew has proposed a strange idea to Commander Norton. He belongs to a line of Christians who believe that Jesus was an alien, and he believes that Rama may be a second ark, sent to save the worthy from an impending catastrophe on Earth. His proof of this is that Rama seems to be brand new. Nothing in it seems to have been touched, yet it has a breathable atmosphere, water that once distilled or filtered is drinkable, plots of land that seem to be farmable, but no life at all. No alien corpses had been found even, and everything seemed untouched, brand new, as if it was built for a purpose and sent to Earth for a reason. He believed that proof of this theory would come when Rama parked near Earth's orbit after it made a braking maneuver, allowing the citizens of Earth to transfer over to Rama. Once the storms inside Rama had settled, the crew of Endeavour returned to the cylindrical plains of Rama. The first priority was to build a raft and travel to the island they had named New York. The atmosphere was much richer in oxygen than before the lights came on, and when they got to the sea, they found out why. The water was teeming with microorganisms that seemed to have evolved right out of the chemical concoction in the water, turning it green. But as they watched, the organisms died out and returned their nutrients to the water, and the oxygen levels stabilized. As they rafted across the newly melted sea to New York, they made sure not to fall in the water. A quick dip would most likely be fine, but a drink or an extended swim could be deadly. The soup may have been perfect for the oxygen-producing microorganisms to evolve, but it was toxic to humans. Once they reached New York, they found everything was in sets of 9. The Ramans seemed to have a love of triple backups everywhere in Rama, the stairs, the airlocks, the lights, but in New York, they had 3 sets of triple backups it seemed. Everyone agreed it was more like a giant chemical factory than a city. This island had a very important purpose, but what was it? While standing in awe of New York, one young crewman comments that he thinks New York is a factory that gets its ingredients right from the cylindrical sea's chemical-rich water to make ramens. No, the aliens that would live on Rama, not the noodles. No. Oh my god, never mind. When the crew of the raft returned to shore, All they had were theories and nothing else still. New York was just as sealed off as Paris or London, and still no way to get to the other shore thanks to the 500-meter tall cliff with no stairways. But as luck would have it, one of the crew members happened to be a competitor in the Moon Olympics. His sport? Man-powered ultralight racing. He would use an ultra-lightweight plane powered by his pedaling and fly in the moon's gravity, and he just so happened to have smuggled one aboard. So, the plan was for this crew member named Jimmy Pack to fly his ultralight down the axis of Rama to get to the far end. He begins his flight and passes the cylindrical sea and reaches the other side, but it's not at all like the side they entered. Instead of 3 airlocks leading to 3 massive staircases at the end, there are 7 spikes, one in the center on the axis of Rama, surrounded by 6 more in a circle. The 6 were massive, but the center one was twice their size. It was a spike 5 kilometers long, pointing right down the axis of Rama. Jimmy flew up to it and found out it was made of a black, glass-like substance. As Jimmy flew Dragonfly, which is what he named his ultralight, around the spikes, he began to get radio interference, preventing him from trying to land at the buttresses that supported the spike's massive bases. So after sending video of everything he could, he began his trip back. But he had not yet made it the 5 kilometers it would take to clear the tip of the big spike yet, and he started to feel something strange. It was an electrical charge, and suddenly the 7 spikes came to life, with lightning jumping between them. In a panic, Jimmy went down in altitude to try and get away from the lightning, but the electricity is making an ionic wind with the charge imbalance. This was written in 1973, by the way, long before we had these bladeless fans that work on the same principle. Jimmy's Dragonfly was not made to deal with wind. It was made to be used indoors on the moon. And despite his best efforts, Dragonfly collapsed and Jimmy fell to the surface. He was able to use Dragonfly like a parachute, as well as use the fan that propelled it to break his fall, but he still lost consciousness on impact. When he woke up, he met the first resident of Rama. When Jimmy returned to consciousness, the first thing he became aware of was a splitting headache. He almost welcomed it, at least it proved that he was alive. Then he tried to move, and at once a wide selection of aches and pains brought themselves to his attention, but as far as he could tell, nothing seemed to be broken. After that, he risked opening his eyes, but closed them at once when he found himself staring straight into the band of light along the ceiling of the world. As a cure for a headache, that view was not recommended. He was still lying there, regaining his strength and wondering how soon it would be safe to open his eyes, when there was a sudden crunching noise from close at hand. Turning his head slowly towards the source of the sound, he risked a look, and almost lost consciousness again. Not more than 5 meters away, a large crab-like creature was apparently dining on the wreckage of poor Dragonfly. When Jimmy had recovered his wits, he rolled slowly and quietly away from the monster, expecting at every moment to be seized by its claws when it discovered that more appetizing fare was available. However, it took not the slightest notice of him. When he had increased their mutual separation to 10 meters, he cautiously propped himself up in a sitting position. From this greater distance, the thing did not appear quite so formidable. It had a low, flat body about 2 meters long and 1 wide, supported on 6 triple-jointed legs. Jimmy saw that he was mistaken in assuming that it had been eating Dragonfly. In fact, he could not see any sign of a mouth. The creature was actually doing a neat job of demolition, using scissor-like claws to chop the skybike into small pieces. A whole row of manipulators, which looked uncannily like tiny human hands, then transferred the fragments to a steadily growing pile on the animal's back. But was it an animal? Though that had been Jimmy's first reaction, now he had second thoughts. There was a purposefulness about its behavior that suggested fairly high intelligence. He could see no reason why any creature of pure instinct should be carefully collecting the scattered pieces of his skybike, unless perhaps it was gathering material for a nest. Keeping a wary eye on the crab, which still ignored him completely, Jimmy struggled to his feet. A few wavering steps demonstrated that he could walk, though he was not sure if he could outdistance those 6 legs. When he switched on his radio, never doubting that it would still be operating, a crash that he could survive would not even have been noticed by its solid-state electronics. "Hub control," he said softly. "Can you receive me?" "Thank God, are you okay?" "Just a bit shaken. Take a look at this." He turned his camera towards the crab, just in time to record the final demolition of Dragonfly's wing. "What the devil is it? And why is it chewing up your bike? Wish I knew. It's finished with Dragonfly. I'm going to back away in case it wants to start on me. Jimmy slowly retreated, never taking his eyes off the crab. It was now moving round and round in a steadily widening spiral, apparently searching for fragments it might have overlooked. And so Jimmy was able to get an overall view of it for the first time. Now that the initial shock had worn off, he could appreciate that it was quite a handsome beast. The name crab, which he had automatically given to it, was perhaps a little misleading. If it had not been so imposingly large, he might have called it a beetle. Its carapace had a beautiful metallic sheen. He would almost have been prepared to swear that it was metal. That was an interesting idea. Could it be a robot and not an animal? He stared at the crab intently, with this thought in his mind, analyzing all the details of its anatomy. Where it should have had a mouth was a collection of manipulators that reminded Jimmy strongly of the multi-purpose knives that are the delight of all red-blooded boys. There were pinchers, probes, rasps, and even something that looked like a drill. But this was not decisive. On Earth, the insect world had matched all these tools and many more. The animal or robot question remained in perfect balance in his mind. The eyes, which might have settled the matter, left it even more ambiguous. They were so deeply recessed in protective hoods that it was impossible to tell whether their lenses were made of crystal or of jelly. They were quite expressionless, and of a startling vivid blue. Though they had been directed towards Jimmy several times, they had never shown the slightest flicker of interest. In his perhaps biased opinion, that decided the level of the creature's intelligence. An entity, robot or animal, which could ignore a human being could not be very bright. It had stopped its circling and stood still for a few seconds, as if listening to some inaudible message. Then it set off, with a curious rolling gait, in the general direction of the sea. It moved in a perfect straight line at a steady 4 or 5 kilometers an hour, and had already traveled a couple of 100 meters before Jimmy's still slightly shocked mind registered the fact that the last sad relics of his beloved dragonfly were being carried away from him. He set off in hot and indignant pursuit. His action was not wholly illogical. The crab was heading towards the sea, and if any rescue was possible, it would be only from this direction. Moreover, he wanted to discover what the creature would do with its trophy. That should reveal something about its motivation and intelligence. Because he was bruised and stiff, it took Jimmy several minutes to catch up with the purposefully moving crab. When he had done so, he followed it at a respectful distance, until he felt sure it did not resent his presence. It was then that he noticed his water flask and emergency ration pack among the debris of Dragonfly, and felt instantly both hungry and thirsty. There, scuttling away from him at a remorseless 5 kilometers an hour, was the only food and drink in all this half of the world. Whatever the risk, he had to get a hold of it. He cautiously closed in on the crab, approaching from the right rear. While he kept station with it, he studied the complicated rhythm of its legs, until he could anticipate where they would be at any moment. When he was ready, he muttered a quick, "Excuse me," and shot swiftly in to grab his property. Jimmy had never dreamed that he would one day have to exercise the skills of a pickpocket, but he was delighted with his success. He was out again in less than a second, and the crab never slackened its steady pace. He dropped back a dozen meters, moistened his lips from the flask, and started to chew a bar of meat concentrate. The little victory made him feel much happier. Now he could even risk thinking about his somber future. While there was life, there was hope. Yet he could imagine no way in which he could possibly be rescued. Even if his colleagues crossed the sea, how could he reach them half a kilometer below? "We'll find a way down somehow," Hub Control had promised. "That cliff can't go right around the world without a break anywhere." He had been tempted to answer, "Why not?" but had thought better of it. One of the strangest things about walking inside Rama was that you could always see your destination. Here, the curve of the world did not hide, it revealed. For some time, Jimmy had been aware of the crab's objective. Up there in the land that seemed to rise before him was a half-kilometer wide pit. It was one of 3 in the southern hemisphere. From the hub, it had been impossible to see how deep they were. All had been named after prominent lunar craters. And he was approaching Copernicus. The name was hardly appropriate, for there were no surrounding hills, no central peaks. This Copernicus was merely a deep shaft, or well, with perfectly vertical sides. When he came close enough to look into it, Jimmy was able to see a pool of ominous leaden green water at least half a kilometer below. This would put it just about level with the sea, and he wondered if they were connected. Winding down the interior of the well was a spiral ramp, completely recessed into the sheer wall, so the effect was rather like that of rifling in an immense gun barrel. There seemed to be a remarkable number of turns. Not until Jimmy had traced them for several revolutions, getting more and more confused in the process, did he realize that there was not one ramp, but 3, totally independent and 120 degrees apart. In any other background than Rama, the whole concept would have been an impressive architectural tour de force. The 3 ramps led straight down to the pool and disappeared beneath its opaque surface. Near the waterline, Jimmy could see a group of black tunnels, or caves. They looked rather sinister, and he wondered if they were inhabited. Perhaps the Ramans were amphibious. As the crab approached the edge of the well, Jimmy assumed it was going to descend one of the ramps, perhaps taking the wreckage of Dragonfly to some entity who would be able to evaluate it. Instead, the creature walked straight to the brink, extended half its body over the gulf without any sign of hesitation, though an error of a few centimeters would have been disastrous, and gave a brisk shrug. The fragments of Dragonfly went fluttering down into the depths. There were tears in Jimmy's eyes as he watched them go. So much, he thought bitterly, for this creature's intelligence. Having disposed of the garbage, the crab swung around and started to walk towards Jimmy, standing only about 10 meters away. Am I going to get the same treatment? He wondered. He hoped the camera was not too unsteady as he showed hub control the rapidly approaching monster. What do you advise? He whispered anxiously, without much hope that he would get a useful answer. It was some small consolation to realize that he was making history, and his mind raced through the approved pattern for such a meeting. Until now, all of these had been purely theoretical. He would be the first man to check them in practice. Don't run until you're sure it's hostile, hub control whispered back to him. Run where? Jimmy asked himself. He thought he could outdistance the thing in a 100-meter sprint, but he had a sick certainty it would wear him down over the long haul. Slowly, Jimmy held up his outstretched hand. Men had been arguing for 200 years about this gesture. Would every creature, everywhere in the universe, interpret this as, see, no weapons? But no one could think of anything better. The crab showed no reaction, however, nor did it slacken its pace. Ignoring Jimmy completely, it walked straight past him and headed purposefully into the south. Feeling extremely foolish, the acting representative of Homo sapiens watched the first contact stride away across the Raman plain, totally indifferent to his presence. He had seldom been so humiliated in his life. Then his sense of humor came to the rescue. After all, it was no great matter to have been ignored by an animated garbage truck. It would have been worse if it had greeted him as a long-lost brother. That line kills me. After this, Jimmy traveled to the edge of the sea, sightseeing as he went, trying not to think about the fact he may be stranded, and may be as good as dead already. On his walk, he encountered many strange things. This end of Rama was made up of all kinds of plots, each one containing a different and confusing substance or item. Some were smooth, some rough, some flat, some bumpy, some squishy, some solid, some wet, some dry. But some looked to be soil, under a thin sheet of plastic-like covering. And in one, the covering had been punctured, and a strange thing resembling a flower was growing out of the hole. Jimmy had to wriggle through a tight space to get to it, and was almost trapped on the way out, but he got the flower. Only to regret his decision when the stalk pulled itself back underground as if mortally wounded. Jimmy felt as if he had come and destroyed the most beautiful thing in Rama. Luckily for Jimmy, the big brains back on Earth had figured out a way to rescue him. Not so luckily for him, he had to jump off a 500-meter tall cliff. And the plan was just that. Jump, Jimmy, jump! In the reduced gravity of Rama, and with the sea as a cushion, Jimmy could safely jump off a half-kilometer tall cliff into the water, where the raft they used to explore New York would be waiting for him to get him out of the disgusting water as soon as possible. Terminal velocity on Rama was at maximum 90 miles per hour. A fast and dangerous speed, no doubt, but on Earth, it would be 200 miles per hour. So according to the scientists, 90 miles per hour was a survivable impact. So after throwing his picked flower off the cliff, for the crew at the base to retrieve, he jumped. The fall took over 20 seconds, and when he hit the water, he shot into the depths with who knows what else. His eyes burned every time he opened them, but he needed to know which way was up. After what felt like an eternity, he finally broke the surface, and the crew pulled him on board. But Jimmy Pack's strange day was not over yet. Less than a minute later, the spikes at the pole started to crackle and spark again. Did you swallow any water? Was the commander's anxious question. I don't think so. Rinse your mouth out with this anyway. That's fine. How do you feel? I'm not really sure. I'll let you know in a minute. Oh, thanks everybody. The minute was barely up when Jimmy was only too sure how he felt. I'm going to be sick, he confessed miserably. His rescuers were incredulous. In a dead calm? On a flat sea? Protested Sergeant Barnes, who seemed to regard Jimmy's plight as a direct reflection on her skill. I'd hardly call it flat, said the commander, waving his arms around the band of water that circled the sky. But don't be ashamed. You may have swallowed some of that stuff. Get it out as quickly as you can. Jimmy was still straining unheroically and unsuccessfully when there was a flicker of light in the sky behind them. All eyes turned towards the South Pole, and Jimmy instantly forgot his sickness. The horns had started their fireworks display again. There were the kilometer-long streamers of fire dancing from the central spike to its smaller companions. Once again, they began their stately rotation, as if invisible dancers were winding their ribbons around an electric maypole. But now they began to accelerate, moving faster and faster until they blurred into a flickering cone of light. It was a spectacle more awe-inspiring than any they had yet seen here, and it brought with it a distant crackling roar, which added to the impression of overwhelming power. The display lasted for about 5 minutes. Then it stopped as abruptly as if someone had turned a switch. I'd like to know what the Rama committee make of that, Norton muttered to no one in particular. Has anyone here got any theories? There was no time for an answer, because at that moment, Hub Control called in great excitement. Resolution! Are you okay? Did you feel that? Feel what? We think it was an earthquake. It must have happened the minute those fireworks stopped. Any damage? I don't think so. It wasn't really violent, but it shook us up a bit. We felt nothing at all, but we wouldn't out here on the sea. Of course, silly me. Anyway, everything seems quiet now, until next time. Yes, until next time, Norton echoed. The mystery of Rama was steadily growing. The more they discovered about it, the less they understood. There was a sudden shout from the helm. Skipper, look up there in the sky! Norton lifted his eyes and swiftly scanned the circuit of the sea. He saw nothing until his gaze had almost reached the zenith, and he was staring at the other side of the world. My God, he whispered slowly, as he realized that the next time was already almost here. A tidal wave was racing towards them down the eternal curve of the cylindrical sea. Even in that moment of shock, Norton's first concern was for his ship. Endeavor, he called. Situation report. All okay, Skipper, was the reassuring answer from Exec. We felt a slight tremor, but nothing that could cause any damage. There's been a small change in attitude. The bridge says about 0.2 degrees. They also think the spin rate has altered slightly. We'll have an accurate reading on that in a couple of minutes. So it's beginning to happen, Norton said to himself, and a lot earlier than we expected. We're still a long ways from perihelion, and the logical time for an orbit change. But some kind of trim was undoubtedly taking place, and there might be more shocks to come. Meanwhile, the effects of this first one were all too obvious. Up there on the curving sheet of water that seemed perpetually falling from the sky, the wave was about 10 kilometers away, and stretched the full width of the sea, from northern to southern shore. Near the land, it was a foaming wall of white, but in deeper water, it was a barely visible blue line moving much faster than the breakers on either flank. The drag of the shoreward shallows was already bending it into a bow, with the central portion getting farther and farther ahead. Sergeant, said Norton urgently, this is your job. What can we do? Sergeant Barnes had brought the raft completely to rest and was studying the situation intently. Her expression, Norton was relieved to see, showed no trace of alarm. Rather, a certain zestful excitement, like that of a skilled athlete about to accept a challenge. I wish we had some soundings, she said. If we're in deep water, then there's nothing to worry about. Then we're all right. We're about 4 kilometers from shore. I hope so, but I want to study the situation. She applied power again and swung resolution around until it was just underway, heading directly towards the approaching wave. Norton judged that the swiftly moving central portion would reach them in less than 5 minutes, but he could also see that it presented no serious danger. It was only a racing ripple a fraction of a meter high, and would scarcely rock the boat. The walls of foam lagging far behind it were the real menace. Suddenly, in the very center of the sea, a line of breakers appeared. The wave had clearly hit a submerged wall, several kilometers in length, not far below the surface. At the same time, the breakers on the 2 flanks collapsed as they ran into deeper water. Anti-sloshing plates, Norton told himself, exactly the same as in Endeavor's own propellant tanks, but on a 1,000-fold greater scale. There must be a complex pattern of them all around the sea to damp out any waves as quickly as possible. The only thing that matters now is, are we right on top of one? Sergeant Barnes was one jump ahead of him. She brought Resolution to a full stop and threw out the anchor. It hit bottom at only 5 meters. "Haul it up," she called to her crewmates. "We've got to get away from here." Norton agreed heartily. But in which direction? The sergeant was headed full speed towards the wave, which was now only 5 kilometers away. For the first time, he could hear the sound of its approach, a distant, unmistakable roar, which he had never expected to hear inside Rama. Then it changed in intensity. The central portion was collapsing again, and the flanks again were building up. He tried to estimate the distance between the submerged baffles, assuming that they were spaced at equal intervals. If he was right, there should be one more to come. If they could station the raft in the deep water between them, they would be perfectly safe. Sergeant Barnes cut the motor and threw out the anchor again. It went down 30 meters without hitting bottom. "We're okay," she said with a sigh of relief, "but I'll keep the motor running." Now, there were only the lagging walls of foam along the coast. Out there in the central sea, it was calm again, apart from an inconspicuous blue ripple still speeding towards them. The sergeant was just holding Resolution on course towards the disturbance, ready to pour on full power at a moment's notice. Then, only 2 kilometers ahead of them, the sea started to foam once more. It humped up in a white-maned fury, and now its roaring seemed to fill the world. Upon the 16-kilometer-high wave of the cylindrical sea, a smaller ripple was superimposed, like an avalanche thundering down a mountain slope, and that ripple was quite large enough to kill them. Sergeant Barnes must have seen the expression on the faces of her crewmates. She shouted above the roar, "What are you scared about? I've ridden bigger ones than this." That was not quite true, nor did she add that her earlier experience had been in a well-built surf boat, not an improvised raft. "But if we have to jump, wait until I tell you. Check your life jackets." She's magnificent, like a Viking warrior going into battle, and obviously enjoying every minute, thought the commander. And she's probably right, unless we've miscalculated badly. The wave continued to rise, curving upward and over. The slope above them probably exaggerated its height, but it looked enormous, an irresistible force of nature that would overwhelm everything in its path. Then, within seconds, it collapsed, as if its foundations had been pulled out from underneath it. It was over the submerged barrier, in deep water again. When it reached them, a minute later, Resolution merely bounced up and down a few times before Sergeant Barnes swung her around and set off at top speed towards the north. "Thanks, Ruby, that was splendid. But will we get home before it comes around for the second time?" "Probably not. It will be back in about 20 minutes, but it will have lost all its strength by then. We'll scarcely notice it." Now that the wave had passed, they could relax and enjoy the voyage, though no one would be completely at ease until they were back on land. The disturbance had left the water swirling in random eddies, and had also stirred up the most peculiar acidic smell, like crushed ants, as Jimmy put it well. Though unpleasant, the odor caused none of the attacks of seasickness that might have been expected. It was something so alien that human physiology could not respond to it. A minute later, the wave front hit the next underwater barrier as it climbed away from them and up into the sky. This time, seen from the rear, the spectacle was unimpressive, and the voyagers were ashamed of their previous fears. They began to feel themselves masters of the cylindrical sea. The shock was therefore all the greater when not more than 100 meters away, something like a slowly rotating wheel began to rear up out of the water. Glittering metallic spokes, 5 meters long, emerged, dripping, spun for a moment in the fierce Raman glare, and splashed back. It was as if a giant starfish with tubular arms had broken the surface. At first sight, it was impossible to tell whether it was an animal or machine. Then it flopped over and lay half awash, bobbing up and down in the gentle aftermath of the wave. Now they could see that there were 9 arms, apparently jointed, radiating from a central disc. 2 of the arms were broken, snapped off at the outer joint. The others ended at a complicated collection of manipulators that reminded Jimmy strongly of the crab he had encountered. The 2 creatures came from the same line of evolution, or the same drawing board. At the middle of the disc was a small turret bearing 3 large eyes. 2 were closed, 1 open, and even that appeared to be blank and unseeing. No one doubted that they were watching the death throes of some strange monster tossed up to the surface by the submarine disturbance that had just passed. Then they saw that it was not alone. Swimming around it and snapping at its still feebly moving limbs were two small beasts like overgrown lobsters. They were efficiently chopping up the monster, and it did nothing to resist, though its own claws seemed quite capable of dealing with the attackers. Again, Jimmy was reminded of the crab that had demolished Dragonfly. He watched intently as the one-sided conflict continued, and quickly confirmed his impression. "Look, Skipper," he whispered. "Do you see? They're not eating it. They don't even have any mouths. They're simply chopping it to pieces. That's exactly what happened to Dragonfly." "You're right. They're dismantling it. Like a broken machine." Norton wrinkled his nose. "But no dead machine ever smelled like that." Then another thought struck him. "My God, suppose they start on us. Ruby, get us back to shore as quickly as you can." Resolution surged forward with reckless disregard for the life of her power cells. Behind them, the 9 spokes of the great starfish, they could think of no better name for it, were clipped steadily shorter, and presently the weird tabulo sank back into the depths of the sea. After they made their way back to safety, a strange creature came to the camp at the base of the stairs. It had 3 eyes equally spaced around what must have been its head. Below the head, there was no body, just 3 long, thin legs. These creatures, that the crew called spiders, pivoted to move, making it spin as it traveled. And they traveled very fast. This, combined with how thin they were, made them difficult to focus on while they were moving. And I say they, because after the first one examined the base camp, and then went up the stairs, or the slope next to the stairs rather, and examined the higher camps also, soon all of Rama was filled with them. They seemed to be everywhere. Eventually one spider died by falling down the slope next to the great stairs, allowing the biologists to dissect it. It had no mouth, no stomach, no organs at all except for a brain that seemed to be tuned for the creature's trinocular vision. And biological batteries, just like the electric eel has. But unlike an electric eel, they used the electricity to power themselves. Their bodies ran on the electricity. After the spiders, many more kinds of creatures showed up. Some were 2-headed giraffes that seemed to be used as mobile cranes. Others looked like a mix of a bulldozer and a hippopotamus. At this point, the crew dubbed all the creatures of Rama to be biots. They didn't seem to be normal creatures, nor robots, but something in between. Back on Earth, they speculated that Rama changing its orientation was in preparation for its eventual braking maneuver. For reasons known only to them, the government of Mercury decided to take a proactive stance unilaterally of the Federation of Planets, and sent a nuke to Rama. The nuke came up to Rama and paralleled it only a few dozen kilometers away. An ambassador of Mercury assured the crew of Endeavour that they would give ample time to get away from Rama before they blew it up, but said that they only sent the nuclear missile as a safety measure. The government of Mercury, however, had a different idea of ample than Commander Norton, as well as a different idea of what a safety measure is. And shortly thereafter, without giving any reason, and with nothing to prompt it from either Rama or Commander Norton, the Mercury government suddenly told Commander Norton to get his crew in his ship and get Endeavour away from Rama in the next hour. This was entirely impossible, with some members of the crew as far away as the edge of the cylindrical sea. Luckily, Rodriguez, the guy who thinks Jesus might have been an alien, had already come up with a plan. He had stripped down a scooter, and with permission from Commander Norton, had headed for the nuke. There was a time delay for the signal to get from the missile to Mercury of 10 minutes. Rodriguez had left the Endeavour 5 minutes ago when the missile came to life and started to head for Rama with Rodriguez attached to it. Luckily, Rodriguez had disabled the bomb before the cameras on it could even get their signal all the way to Mercury. So even if Mercury had tried to detonate the bomb as soon as they saw Rodriguez coming for the missile on their cameras, it would have already been too late. The government of Mercury would not be happy, but the crew of Endeavour and Rama were safe. Rama's dive into the solar system was now getting it too close to the sun for Endeavour to survive, sitting on its skin. Commander Norton had only 2 days left before he was forced to leave by the heat. He decided that this was finally time to take a more destructive approach, and he took a crew and a very powerful laser to London. They sliced open the skin of one of the buildings to see what was inside. What they found were pillars of glass filling the room, but not so closely packed that you could not walk between them. They seemed to be just clear crystal, but suddenly one member of the team shouted out. He had discovered that if you looked at the pillars from the right angle with the right light, you could see holograms inside. Each pillar contained multiple holograms depending on the angle of the viewer and its light source. They saw all kinds of mundane instruments just slightly altered to fit hands with different bones than humans. Finally, they found what seemed to be a utility suit for an intelligent creature, full of features and pockets that no beast of burden could possibly understand. But this harness had holes for 3 arms, and was about as tall as the tallest human basketball player, if not taller. Another cry from outside brought Commander Norton back to the hole they had cut into the side of the building. The lights were fading outside. Rama seemed to be going dark again. Commander took this as his cue to leave. Had he triggered it with his destruction of the building? Suddenly, a tremor could be felt through his feet. He called to the bridge of Endeavor and was told that Rama was again changing orientation. Commander Norton ordered all his crew to head back to Endeavor. He was the last one up the stairs, but as they all climbed, suddenly the lights changed from solid lights to purple balls of light progressing from both ends of the cylinder that is Rama to the center. This was clearly an order for all of the biots, because suddenly every biot on Rama was charging full speed to the sea and jumping in. The only exception to this seemed to be the crabs, who were still busily disassembling anything that was not running into the sea. In the sea, all the animals could be seen getting disassembled by the lobsters in the water. Rama was returning to an empty world with a strange sea full of chemicals. Finally, Commander Norton made his way back up to Endeavor. He took his last look up at the interior of Rama, and then took Endeavor away from Rama and began his departure orbit as Rama continued its turn around the sun. Norton was having his first good night's sleep, 30 hours after leaving Rama, when he was rudely shaken back into consciousness. He cursed groggily, opening a bleary eye at Carl Mercer, and then, like any good commander, was instantly wide awake. It stopped turning? Yes, steady as a rock. Let's go to the bridge. The whole ship was awake. Even the simps knew that something was afoot, and made anxious meeping noises until McAndrews reassured them with a swift hand signal. As Norton slipped into his chair and fastened the restraints around his waist, he wondered if this might be yet another false alarm. Rama was now foreshortened into a stubby cylinder, and the searing rim of the sun had peaked over one edge. Norton jockeyed Endeavor gently back into the umbra of the artificial eclipse, and saw the pearly splendor of the corona reappear across a background of the brighter stars. There was one huge prominence, at least 500,000 kilometers high, that had climbed so far from the sun that its upper branches looked like a tree of crimson fire. Sorry, little side note, I saw an eclipse with the same kind of thing going on, and it was pure white, actually. It wasn't orange or red. It was once the sun was totally eclipsed by the moon, the corona was the whitest thing I've ever seen, like the whitest light you've ever imagined. Anyway, sorry, just a little sidetrack there, back to the book. So now we have to wait, Norton told himself. The important thing is not to get bored, to be ready to react at a moment's notice, to keep all the instruments aligned and recording no matter how long it takes. This was strange. The starfield was shifting, almost as if he had actuated the roll thrusters, but he had touched no controls, and if there had been any real movement, he would have sensed it at once. "Skipper," said Calvert urgently from the nav position, "we're rolling, look at the stars. But I'm getting no instrument readings. Rate gyros operating? Perfectly normal. I see the 0 jitter, but we're rolling several degrees a second. That's impossible. Of course it is, but look for yourself." When all else failed, a man had to rely on eyeball instrumentation. Norton could not doubt that the starfield was indeed slowly rotating. There went Sirius across the rim of the port. Either the universe, in a reversion to pre-Copernican cosmology, had suddenly decided to revolve around Endeavor, or the stars were standing still and the ship was turning. The second explanation seemed rather more likely, yet it evolved apparently insoluble paradoxes. If the ship was really turning at this rate, he would have felt it, literally by the seat of his pants, as the old saying went, and the gyros could not have all failed simultaneously and independently. Only one answer remained. Every atom of Endeavor must be in the grip of some force, and only a powerful gravitational field could produce this effect. At least no other known field could. Suddenly the stars vanished. The blazing disk of the sun had emerged from behind the shield of Rama, and its glare had driven them from the sky. "Can you get a radar reading? What's the Doppler?" Norton was fully prepared to find that this too was inoperative, but he was wrong. Rama was underway at last, accelerating at the modest rate of 0.015 gravities. Dr. Pereira, Norton thought, would be pleased. He had predicted a maximum of 0.02. and Endeavour was somehow caught in its wake, like a piece of flotsam whirling round and round behind a speeding ship. Hour after hour, that acceleration held constant. Rama was falling away from Endeavour at steadily increasing speed. As the distance grew, the anomalous behavior of the ship slowly ceased. The normal laws of inertia started to operate again. They could only guess at the energies in whose backlash they had been briefly caught, and Norton was thankful that he had stationed Endeavour at a safe distance before Rama had switched on its drive. As to the nature of that drive, one thing was now certain, even though all else was a mystery. There were no jets of gas, no beams of ion or plasma thrusting Rama into its new orbit. No one put it better than Sergeant Professor Myron when he said in shocked disbelief, "There goes Newton's third law." It was Newton's third law, however, upon which Endeavour had to depend the next day, when she used her very last reserves of propellant to bend her own orbit outward from the sun. The change was slight, but it would increase her perihelion distance by 10 million kilometers. That was the difference between running the ship's cooling system at 95% capacity and a certain fiery death. When they had completed their own maneuver, Rama was 200,000 kilometers away and difficult to see against the glare of the sun. But they could obtain accurate radar measurements of its orbit, and the more they observed, the more puzzled they became. They checked the figures over and over again, until there was no escaping the unbelievable conclusion. It looked as if all the fears of the Hermians, the heroism of Rodrigo, and the rhetoric of the General Assembly had been utterly in vain. What a cosmic irony, thought Norton as he looked at his final figures. If after 1,000,000 years of safe guidance, Rama's computers had made one trifling error, perhaps changing the sign of an equation from a plus to minus. Everyone had been so certain that Rama would lose speed, that it would be captured by the sun's gravity and thus become a new planet of the solar system. It was doing just the opposite. It was gaining speed, and in the worst possible direction. Rama was falling ever more swiftly into the sun. As the details of its new orbit became more and more clearly defined, it was hard to see how Rama could possibly escape disaster. Only a handful of comets has ever passed as close to the sun. At perihelion, it would be less than 500,000 kilometers above that inferno of fusing hydrogen. No solid material could withstand the temperatures of such an approach. The tough alloy that composed Rama's hull would start to melt at 10 times that distance. Endeavour had now passed its own perihelion, to everyone's relief, and was slowly increasing its distance from the sun. Rama was far ahead on its closer, swifter orbit, and already appeared well inside the outermost fringes of the corona. The ship would have a grandstand view of the drama's final stage. Then, 5 million kilometers from the sun, and still accelerating, Rama started to spin its cocoon. Until now, it had been visible under the maximum power of Endeavour's telescopes, as a tiny bright bar. Suddenly, it began to scintillate like a star seen through horizon mists. It almost seemed as if it was disintegrating. When he saw the image breaking up, Norton felt a poignant sense of grief at the loss of so much wonder. Then he realized that Rama was still there, but that it was surrounded by a shimmering haze. And then it was gone. In its place was a brilliant star-like object showing no visible disk, as if Rama had contracted into a tiny ball. It was some time before they figured out what had happened. Rama had indeed disappeared. It was now surrounded by a perfectly reflecting sphere, about 100 kilometers in diameter. All that they could now see was the reflection of the sun itself on the curved portion that was closest to them. Behind this protective bubble, Rama was presumably safe from the solar inferno. As the hours passed, the bubble changed its shape. The image of the sun became elongated, distorted. The sphere was turning into an ellipsoid. Its long axis pointed in the direction of Rama's flight. It was then that the first anomalous reports started coming in from the robot observatories, which, for almost 200 years, had been keeping a permanent watch on the sun. Something was happening to the solar magnetic field in the region around Rama. The million-kilometer-long lines of force that threaded the corona and drove its wisps of fiercely ionized gas at speeds that sometimes defied even the crushing gravity of the sun were shaping themselves around that glittering ellipsoid. Nothing was yet visible to the eye, but the orbiting instruments reported every change in magnetic flux and ultraviolet radiation. And presently, even the eye could see the change in the corona. A faint glowing tube or tunnel, 100,000 kilometers long, had appeared high in the outermost atmosphere of the sun. It was slightly curved, bending along the orbit Rama was tracing, and Rama itself, or the protective cocoon around it, was visible as a glittering bead racing faster and faster down that ghostly tube through the corona. For it was still gaining speed. Now, it was moving at more than 2,000 kilometers a second, and there was no question of it ever remaining a captive of the sun. Now, at last, the Raman strategy was obvious. They had come so close to the sun merely to tap its energies at the source, and to speed themselves even faster on the way to their ultimate unknown goal. Soon it seemed that they were tapping more than energy. No one could ever be certain of this, because the nearest observing instruments were 30 million kilometers away, but there were definite indications that matter was flowing from the sun into Rama itself, as if it was replacing the leakage and losses of 10,000 centuries in space. Faster and faster, Rama swept around the sun, moving more swiftly than any object that had ever traveled through the solar system. In less than 2 hours, its direction of motion had swung through more than 90 degrees and had given a final, almost contemptuous proof of its total lack of interest in all the worlds whose peace of mind it had so rudely disturbed. It was dropping out of the ecliptic, down into the southern sky, far below the plane in which all the planets move. Though that, surely, could not be its ultimate goal. It was aimed squarely at the Greater Magellanic Cloud and the lonely gulfs beyond the Milky Way. So after all that build-up, all that expectation, all those theories, everyone was wrong. Rama had no interest in the Earth. Rama was just using the sun to continue on its voyage alone through interstellar space. We thought we were so important, so special, and in the end, we were a coincidence at best. Really reminds you of the folly of ego, of assuming you are the most important species in the room. Well, if you like that... please like, comment, and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. I'm trying to grow the channel, and every sub helps. It doesn't cost you anything. It's just a little click down the corner, and it helps me out a lot. And hopefully I'll see you back here for another one.